Hello and welcome to the Business Thorecast. In today's episode, we're going to talk to Chris Gomez, United States Navy SEAL and Afterburner team member. We're also going to talk about how do you overcome adversity as a team. How do you fail forward? How do you teach your team that it's okay to make mistakes, but you never make the same mistake twice, and give them a way to iterate and improve? And then, how do you create the culture that supports all this? So it's not you having to micromanage the team and lean in through processes, but the culture that actually makes that happen on its own. Chris Gomez is going to help share his story from a Navy SEAL perspective, and we're going to hear about that and more today on the Business Thorecast. We've been listening to these in the past. You know that we always start off with a military story, and this week we're going to talk about when I went to be a trainer in the pilot training pipeline. So when I graduated pilot training, I'm 22 years old, and went through the process of learning to be a U.S. Air Force pilot. Not a fighter pilot yet. I was a pilot, and that's an important distinction. And we used to say that, it's one thing to be able to ice skate well. It's a totally different thing to be able to play hockey. It's one thing to be able to fly the airplane well. Totally different thing to be able to fly it tactically at the same time. So I'm a pilot. I was sent right back to that same program that I just graduated from as an instructor. So I'm now instructing the 21-year-old, 22-year-old students that are coming in and becoming the Air Force's newest pilots. And one of the challenges that we had been presented with was determining out of a class full of 30 people who are going to be the 3 fighter pilots out of that group. Out of a class full of 30 people, who are the ones that were able to be a pilot, period? Who are the ones that were capable of making it through that program? We had a running joke in our squadron that maybe when they walked into the room, the best way to figure out who should be a fighter pilot was to punch him in the face and see who jumped up and fought you back. And of course, we're talking in jest, but what we're really getting to is who are the ones that were going to have the grit to overcome adversity. And today, we're really excited to have Chris Gomez on the show because Chris is no stranger to adversity, but he's also a great friend of mine. Chris and I met in the business school back at University of Texas, Hook 'em Horns. And Chris, welcome to the show today.
Hey, thanks a lot, Thor. I'm happy to be here. It was funny you were talking about how you go from being a great skater or an ice skater to working into a hockey player, and I thought you were going to use the analogy that how do you go from a great skater to being a great figure skater like the majority of Air Force folks I know. So that's great. Glad you went the hockey route.
So 3 minutes into it and we had an Air Force joke. I think that's a new record for our SEAL. He couldn't contain himself. He couldn't wait any longer until he got that one out there. Yeah, welcome to the show. So you and I have been working together at Afterburner. We went to business school together. And, of course, I've heard your stories over and over and over again ad nauseum. But they are really interesting and they are really exciting. And I thought they'd be a great way to segue how you brought team members together in arguably the most elite teams in the world, and at least the most challenging ones to become a part of. When we go talk to NFL teams, the SEALs like to remind the NFL teams that we create less SEALs each year than we do NFL players. So it's actually harder to become a SEAL from a probability and percentage standpoint than it is to become an NFL player. But you were not only a SEAL, you also went on to become a trainer of SEALs and teach in that Buzz course at the end. So you've seen adversity, you've had to see your way through adversity, and then you've put those obstacles in front of students and assessed how they got around them as well. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. It was very interesting because people often ask, so how is it that you made it through SEAL training? And SEAL training is notoriously difficult. We like to pride ourselves in saying it's one of the most difficult training environments in the world. And as a 19-year-old kid, I can think back to that time and I say, you know what? I guess I was just too dumb to quit. I was a bullheaded 19-year-old who happened to go through BUD/S at a time when it was the coldest November and the coldest December on record. So we had a very difficult Hell Week experience. And Hell Week is the culmination of your first phase in training, essentially. And it was brutally tough. And so we were able to adapt and react and to overcome those individual failures and the difficulties that we experienced throughout that training.
So I think everybody, always gets attached to stories, and they want to hear the actual experiences. And so we've heard these before. Marcus Luttrell did a great job of writing about them in his book, and a couple other SEALs have too. But you've talked about BUDS, which to the listeners, they may or may not know, that's the training that you go to determine whether or not you will be a SEAL. It has a huge attrition rate. It's extremely difficult, extremely challenging. Go into a little bit more detail. Bring us back there to that pier back in San Diego that you're on in 20-degree weather.
Yeah, I sure can. So BUDS, for those who don't know, stands for Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. And again, it's a long process. People think about Hell Week, and that is the 5th week in training. And they think, oh, well, once you finish Hell Week, it's all downhill. And that certainly isn't the case. Hell Week back in my day was on the 5th week of training out of 26 weeks of training. So that was just the period where we had the most attrition. When you think back, we started my BUDS class. We all showed up to San Diego in Coronado there with 176 sailors that were ready to join this class. So 176 guys in great physical shape showed up with the intent or with the intention of being a SEAL. And so 176 classed up. We went through what was called indoctrination phase, which is 3 weeks of nothing. It's 3 weeks of a couple of tests to make sure you're physically fit enough, a couple of medical checks. You learn how to operate the boats and how to maintain some of your gear. But then you class up. We call it the class up date was day 1, week 1. We classed up 112 individuals. So we lost 64 guys along the way. And it was 64 people who were ready to go, that they showed up. They maybe faced the reality of it. Maybe there were some injuries along the way. But 64 guys washed out. We started day 1, week 1 with 112. We got to Hell Week again, which was 5 weeks later.
So they quit before it even started? They didn't even they were doing the paperwork and said, and they had to do a lot to be selected to even have this opportunity, right?
You have to go through some wickets, but yeah, maybe the paper cuts were a little bit too rough for them or something. I'm not sure. But again, it could
those
be.
Staples are pointy.
Yeah, those staples are rough, man. I'll tell you what. And so, yeah, I don't know what it was that made them bail out early. Some injuries, probably about 5 or 10% of those individuals were due to injury, but a good majority couldn't pass the class up test. A couple others just quit because they saw how daunting, when they look at the whole picture, they saw how daunting it was to go through this 6-month pipeline. And maybe that's what made them bail out.
Yeah, we saw the same thing, though, in pilot training, and you definitely did have to compete for that pilot training spot. And when you're at the Air Force Academy like I was, people were really excited to get the flying slot and that opportunity to go to the training course, and yet you'd still get there. And strangely enough, we had the same thing happen, not to that same percentage. We only had about 5%, but even before we stepped foot in the airplane, before we ever got off the ground, like 5% would quit. It was that fear of the unknown that they weren't able to stand up to. And that's just amazing that slows people down. I would love to talk to some of those people now and just say, like, do you have regrets? Like this, what could possibly get you to that point when you have your shot and cause you to not even try and just turn around and walk away?
Yeah, just not even attempt the first PT that we had. So we classed up again 112. 5 weeks later, we got to Hell Week with 65. So we lost 47 guys through 5 weeks of training, which was a pretty considerable number. So through 5 weeks, we lost 47 more individuals. And then in the next 3 days, we went from 65 to 28. In 3 days, we lost 37 guys who had made it through 5+ weeks of training, and it was extremely difficult. But in a very short time, we lost 37 guys, and it's largely at this point due to the cold or due to the inability to kind of check out from the pain that you're undergoing and that you're experiencing and kind of focus in on the prize, that long-term goal. They were looking at the very short term, the very tactical, and didn't take into account the big picture. This little bit of pain is going to subside, and we're going to go on from there. But unfortunately, 37 other individuals didn't make it.
So it brings us back to that moment. So 37 people are ringing the bell, you guys call it, because you ring the bell and you go get to sit in the hot tub that the BUDS instructors are so nice to provide, and donuts, right? You guys, the instructors have donuts in the hot tub waiting.
They'd be enticing you with hot coffee and donuts, saying, hey, if you want to get off this pier. And so the evolution that you're talking about is called Steel Pier. And Steel Pier is this horrendous evolution where you get down to this pier that's over the San Diego Bay and is a steel pier. We weren't very creative with our naming of our evolutions. So you get over this steel pier and you have to strip down into what your tri shorts, which are these boxer brief type shorts, and you have to go through this iteration of inflating your pants in the water and learning how to stay afloat with the gear that you have. But in between each one of those little cycles, you're laying on your back on this pier and you're being hosed off for 4 hours. And during this time, it happened to be 38 degrees with a wind chill of 20. And a lot of guys decided that was enough. They had it and were wringing out left and right.
Wow. So they get this far and they're freezing, and it's literally what they describe what it's like when it's 20 degrees outside and you're inside the bay in San Diego. What happens to you physically at that point?
Your body at this point just locks up, and you're hoping that you're still shivering, because once you stop shivering, your body core temperature has reached below 95 degrees typically, and your shivering shuts off. Well, we had individuals in our class that had their core temperature down into the upper 80s. We had a couple of individuals who had gotten pulled out because their core temperature was too low. They got rewarmed in that hot tub you spoke of, and as soon as their core temperature got back to a suitable level, they got thrown back into the class. And unfortunately for them, not one person that was ever rewarmed ever stayed long enough to make it through Hell Week, because they had that little taste of what warmth was, and they decided that the pain that they were experiencing at that moment wasn't enough, or was too much to bear.
Well, and they had a medical emergency too. I mean, you're kind of implying like they were weak and they got to taste the hot tub and then they just couldn't forget about that. But they also their core temperature went below 95 or 90 degrees or whatever you guys have going on out there. I mean, these are people who are just saying, okay, I'm going to choose life at this point.
Well, don't do that. How about just keep your core temperature up? My gosh, it's not that hard.
People haven't seen you, so they may not appreciate this, but we all know your secret. It's all the product that you have in your hair and the beard oil, because that keeps you nice and warm. It's like a duck, basically, right?
Yeah, trust me. I wish I had this beard and this belly, for that matter, back when I was going through buds. It would have been much easier to make it through training then.
All right, so you are in this program is down to 30-something people, and you started with 174, and so now we're towards the end. Tell me about finishing the program and what that's like. Yeah,
so we finished Hell Week with 28 guys. And again, this is after now we've completed our 5th week of training, so we're in week number 6. 28 individuals are left. We're standing there. Of that 28, 27 go on to graduate, which is a pretty remarkable number considering we have another 21 weeks of training left.
Yeah.
The issue was that we wanted to put as many impediments in their way as possible to ensure that we were not only assessing but testing the right individuals, that we made sure that we had the right people. And so we put these tests in front of them to see whether they could adapt to the failure that they were inevitably going to face and go on and graduate.
Well, you know that because you got the peek behind the curtain, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how you were an instructor and you saw the other side of it. But let's finish this perspective, because when you're a student, you don't see any of that. There's no rhyme or reason to anything that's happening. You don't know how long you're going to be on the pier. You don't know. I mean, you really know nothing, right? I mean, that's right. The scary part is that it could be 6 hours in this 20-degree weather. That's why people quit, because they if they had a finite time to it, then it'd be easier.
Yeah, there's no clock sitting there on the side of the pier that's counting down the amount of minutes that you have to endure. You don't know. And part of that ambiguity, part of that unknown is what is so daunting.
Yeah. So I think what's most interesting in the conversation, and what I always want to know, is what's the commonality between the folks who make it through, because it's not just the hair product and the beard oil, as much as we'd like to say that's what kept you warm. What if you had to say what the common characteristic of the folks that make it through SEAL training, because it's not the most exceptional athletes, they're in great shape, but everyone's in great shape. What gets you through that experience?
Well, for me, thinking back to it, I was so stubborn, and I knew, I don't know why I understood this, but I knew that there was going to be failures. There was going to be things that I would not be as good at as some other individuals, and there was going to be some things that other individuals wouldn't do as well as I would. And so it was the ability to kind of adapt to that environment, adapt to these failures, be able to push through and make it one evolution at a time, one iterative cycle at a time through each one of these evolutions, knowing that Hell Week, again, starts on a Sunday evening. It lasts straight through until a Friday afternoon. And during this week, you're constantly wet, sandy, you're miserable, you're running everywhere. And during that week, you get a total of 3.5 hours of sleep. And that's not for each night. That's 3.5 hours for the entire week. And so being able to understand that, being able to kind of check out a little bit, push yourself and imagine that the person to my left and to my right are no better than me. They weren't inherently better, as you said. They weren't a better athlete, or they weren't more suited for this type of work. So I knew there was something inside of ourselves that we had to be able to push through. We had to have that grit and that determination, looking at that end goal, that brass ring, and understand that it was everything we were putting up with now was going to be worth it in the long run.
Yeah, I like the word grit, and we've talked about that in the past on these shows. And we talked to Matt Brady, who is part of some of our nation's most critical missions in the past 15 years as a helicopter pilot, and saw some horrible things transpire and lost many team members along the way. But he's got that element as well, that perseverance to get through it. And Angela Duckworth wrote about grit in her book, and she used West Point cadets as the test subject for this common ingredient, because it wasn't intelligence, it wasn't athleticism, it wasn't good looks, it wasn't all those typical things that we associate with successful people. She found out that the common element that the most successful people had was this perseverance and this ability to withstand, whether that's freezing temperatures or just failing and iterating and getting better, the ability to persevere through that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think grit is certainly, it's very hard to measure, and that's what's so difficult about that. It's very difficult to measure somebody's grit and determination.
All right, so let's flip the script. So now you're graduated, you got your trident, you are a Navy SEAL, and then after you do an operational tour, you spent time out there as an operational SEAL across the globe in locations that you can't talk about. Let's go now to your next assignment, which is where you're asked to go back and be on the other side of the curtain for the SEAL training, the BUDS training, where you're now an instructor for these same folks. And you're alluding to it already, but tell me a little bit about what takes place now that you're on that side.
Yeah, so being an instructor was certainly rewarding, because you got that peek behind the curtain to understand all the nonsense that we were put through as students was certainly valuable. And of course, we learned that lesson as we were operational. I'd been colder as an operational SEAL than I ever was during Hell Week and during BUDS. And it's because we had to be able to test for that. And so, going through Hell Week, where it was super cold, was nothing like some of the down pilot exercises we'd done in Alaska, and where we're wet and we're sitting in areas unknown that were freezing our tails off. And so understanding that perspective, and then coming as an instructor and seeing through that lens now the impediments we have to put into place, and to be able to see the individuals that we thought could certainly make it through training, it's an interesting dichotomy, because we couldn't, when you look at 120 students that show up on day one, week one, you would have a hard time discerning who was going to be the guy that made it through, or who was going to be the guy that was going to ring out.
And if you just said, like, hey, do a physical competition and see who wins, that would not be an indicator, right? Like, go run a race and see who wins. Go lift weights.
That's right. So it's like your test of, go see if a pilot, you punch them in the face and see if they get up to fight. That'd be whether or not they'd be a good fighter pilot or not. And that's, BUDS essentially is our punch in the face.
Yeah.
Our punch in the face doesn't last
10 week long.
First phase is our kind of the punch in the face. And that just happens to be 8 weeks of first phase.
Wow. Okay, so now you're on the other side, and now you get to watch the machine in action, and you get to see hundreds of young men go through this scenario, many of which are gifted with great genes and abilities, and they all show up as athletes, but there's only specific folks that make it through. Let's kind of dig into that a bit and talk about, how do you find that group that you believe is going to make it through the adversity, and what does that assessment look like from the new side of this training?
Yes, it's a great question, because when we look at the people that, again, when we look at them day one, week one, the first day they show up, you're looking at some of these individuals are big, huge specimens. I remember one guy who happened to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated back in the late 90s. He was the #1 recruit that he was the number one college recruit, the number one quarterback in the nation. He was a guy that a lot of people that understood football knew, and he went off to go play in the NFL for a brief period of time. And we see this guy show up, and we all knew that he was coming. And you see him, and he's this big 6'4", burly, strapping guy. And we thought, well, that guy has a shot. He's got a chance. But he had a real hard time adjusting to failure as the forthcoming couple of 5 or 6 weeks roll out. We got to see this person for the individual that he was. He was not really a team player. He was not a contributor to the overall good. He was out for himself, and which was a little bit surprising coming from such a team sport. And I do remember this day where one of my other instructors, who happened to be a Division I college football player, we were doing this evolution called life saving. And so we had to go swim out, save an instructor, and you went through 5 iterations, each one getting progressively harder and more difficult. And I remember this other instructor came over and was like, I want him. And he pointed at this one guy. And by the time this evolution was over, that former NFL athlete was crying on the side of the pool, balled up in the fetal position.
Wow.
Because he didn't have what it took. He didn't understand that failure was inevitable, that it's going to happen, and it's about being able to react and kind of humble yourself and iterate on those failures and learn from those mistakes. He never learned from his mistakes. Shortly thereafter, he had wrung out and it was done as a SEAL.
And you've told me these stories before, and it's just amazing to me because you've said we had Division I athletes from every sport you can imagine. We had even professional athletes that have walked away from that career and said, I want to become a Navy SEAL in this course. And they thought it was going to be a cakewalk. Everything up until this point in their lives had been. They'd excelled in the NFL Combine, and yet here they are crying on the side of the pool because they've failed for the first time and they can't get around it.
Yeah, it's just a really interesting thing. And here I am, I hadn't gone to college at this point, and here's this guy who was this phenomenal athlete. A lot of other classmates,
very accomplished,
very accomplished. A lot of these other classmates looked up to this guy. But when you kind of peeled through that veneer and you saw the person was out for himself and was unable to adjust to the inevitable failure, it really became crystal clear that this guy was not cut out for our program.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you bring up. And you told me in the past that when you see these folks come in and you resist the temptation to pick who is going to succeed and make it through the program, you told me that there's one specific time when you were really assessing them, and you wouldn't really pay attention to those elite athletes because, of course, they could run fast, of course, they could hold something up in the air longer, and they had better endurance. Sure. Tell me when you were paying attention to them.
So I was always looking out for these individuals. Like you said, the cream rise to the top. We know that they're going to exceed. They're going to do very well. And the chaff kind of fall along the wayside. They fall off to the bottom, and you don't even pay much attention to them because you know they're eventually going to quit. But what you're looking for in the top tier students is you're looking for them to experience their first failure. And how they react to the inevitable failure was what was so interesting to us. And whenever they kind of grit their teeth and moved on and were able to adapt, you knew that those individuals were gonna do well. And it was those people that kind of balled up or kind of shirked that failure or took it a little bit more personal that you knew were going to have challenges going forward, especially when it comes to the ultimate first phase crucible, which was Hell Week.
I had the exact same experience in the cockpit. And there were plenty of pilots that I flew with that had exceptional hands. They were very gifted with their hand-eye coordination. They worked really hard on the program. And yet I wasn't paying attention to them until they made their first mistake. When they're flying with me and all of a sudden they missed that radio call, and I'm going to watch them now to see if they're able to recover. And it was really interesting. You get to see the difference in character. You get to see whether they fall into one of two categories. Are you a growth mentality, somebody who believes that they can get past their errors, that they can iterate, they can improve, or are you a fixed state mentality where you believe I'm as smart as I'm ever going to be, I'm athletic based on my genes, all I have is what I got going on right now? And you really see down to the core of that person what they believe in that moment. The people who are fixed state mentality, they realize, oh my gosh, I'm not capable of completing this successfully, and it just snowballs, and error after error starts taking place, and they just never recover. people with that growth mentality, they may not be even as capable of pilots as the ones with the fixed state mentality, but they're able to get past those errors and therefore able to be successful in the whole scenario.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And there's certainly people. So every Hell Week as an instructor, and I put on 20 Hell Weeks. So after about 4 or 5 Hell Weeks, I understood what it took to make a good SEAL. And after each one of these Hell Weeks, right before each one of these Hell Weeks would kick off, I would select 5 guys I knew were going to make it and 5 guys I knew were going to quit.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting to see those individuals because I was wrong 2 times. Out of all those individuals, I was wrong twice because of what you just said. I was able to observe their failures and how they would react to them. And based on their reaction to failure was going to determine whether they were going to be successful or not.
That's a really important thing for us to anchor on right there, that you found as a big predictor of success. It wasn't the athleticism. It wasn't what they brought to the table walking in the door. It was the ability to overcome failure. And once you've assessed that capability in the student, you were able to call, now let's see if I get the math right. You said 5 students per class, 20 classes. So are we at 100, or is this the winning 5 and the losing 5 that you picked?
So essentially we were at 200 individuals. I started about 15 classes in.
Yep.
I'm sorry, 5 classes. So it was about 150 individuals.
Okay, so 150 individuals, you're wrong twice. Yeah. So, I mean, Vegas would say that you're a savant and you're doing fantastic, but you're obviously tapping into and reinforcing what folks like Duckworth have said, where grit and perseverance and the ability to iterate is so critical for individuals. So let's translate that then to teams, because a lot of the folks that listen to us want to know, well, how do I really build that team that's going to overcome adversity? How do you assess that? How do you recruit for that? What is it that you were looking for when you were putting them through the training program? First of all, how did you get them through this ridiculously rigorous training program?
Yeah, I love that. I love when you phrase it that way, because you say, how do I get them through? Because I didn't care whether these individuals made it through or not. That's certainly a differentiator between your training and ours, in that first phase was that punch in the face, as we kind of alluded to earlier. I wasn't there to help accompany them through training. This had to be something that they had inherent within themselves. And it was up to the second phase and third phase instructors that taught diving and land warfare and demolitions that helped kind of get them along the way. But for us in first phase, our job was to put as many impediments in front of them as possible to ensure that they were able to react and adapt appropriately to each of those failures that were going to come down the pipe.
Fascinating. And so here we are trying to build elite teams, and when you're recruiting for that elite team in the SEAL world, that meant you're really the goalie for the SEALs. You're really stopping everyone that you can from making it past you, and you didn't see yourself as helping them. You saw yourself as guarding the brand that the SEALs represented. I was a little different. We had we were there to be coaches when we were flying and get as many people through as possible without spoon feeding them the information, and still being able to play the critical evaluator role and say when they weren't capable of flying. But it goes to show you that there is not a perfect recruiting system, not a standard one for every type of group. It comes down to the culture that you want to create, right? And every culture is going to be a little bit different. Investment banking is a lot like the culture that you find in the SEALs. And in the end, it really is close. The Navy SEAL culture and the fighter pilot culture is similar, not just the generic pilot, but the fighter pilot culture is very similar. We're very much the guardians of that brand. Just like investment bankers want to make sure that if you're going to rise up in that group, that you're willing to go through all the pain and all of the things that you need to do to earn your rite of passage and show and prove that you're willing to have the perseverance to make it to the top.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I certainly would agree. I've met and worked with many fighter pilots in the past, and there is a very similar likelihood that we're both looking out for that brand, ensuring that we have the right people, the right folks chosen, because ultimately it's those individuals that are going to be fighting alongside of some of my best friends, and just like you, they're going to be flying alongside of some of your best friends. So you want to ensure that those people are the absolute right people, and that you didn't let a couple of people slip through because you chose not to do your job that day.
Yeah, and it's so critical. And we talk about this with companies all the time, and they say, "Well, how do you create the elite team?" And I'll say, "Where's HR? What are you doing for recruiting? What are you doing for making sure that you're getting the right roster of people that should even consider working for you? Are you creating a self-weeding garden by having a culture that is exclusive?" Which is important, by the way. That's not an arrogant statement to say that you have an exclusive culture. You should want your culture to be clearly defined and be something that both attracts and repels different types of groups. And that very much was the case with being a fighter pilot or a Navy SEAL. We had a very specific individual with a very specific level of dedication that we're looking for to compete and be a part of that team. So let's segue then into my other favorite story that you tell. So you told us about the experience of watching these students. Well, first of all, swimming this when you were a student, and you had to go 50 meters underwater. And this is one of the more challenging things that you guys had to do. And then as an instructor, you had a specific way of knowing when someone was going to fail. And you would even know sometimes when they first started the swim that they were going to fail. And you called this 100% every time. Tell us that story and what you would look for.
Yeah, so this exercise was called the 50-meter underwater swim. And it's a relatively benign evolution. It's essentially testing the individual's will to put up with a little bit of pain to endure a 50-meter swim. So you stand on one side of the pool, you're staring out across a 25-meter pool. And the objective is to jump into that water. Once your feet hit the water and you submerge, you do a frontward somersault, and then you start swimming. And so you're swimming that 25 meters across the pool from essentially a dead stop. You get to that wall on the other side, turn around, push off the wall, and back the other 25 meters, all on one breath hold. Again, it was super challenging just to hear it as a student, but whenever I did it in reality, all it came down to was not quitting and not looking for the easy way out. And so as an instructor, when I was doing that evolution for the students, I remember swimming over the top because we have a 1-to-1 ratio of instructor to student. And you can watch as the individual jumps in, and the minute they start looking for a way out, they could be swimming down at 15 feet of water, and the minute they kind of peer up and look, and it's really subtle, they kind of look out of the corner of their eye to see how deep they are in the water or where that surface is, you knew immediately that that individual wasn't going to make it. They were going to find that easy way out, they were going to bolt, and their day would be over.
All right, so let's apply this to the corporate world. And you and I have spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and I haven't really known you in running around in PT gear as a Navy SEAL. I know you more having a glass of red wine in Silicon Valley with me. But we've gotten to see some of this play out in corporate teams as well. The example that you and I talk about the most is we're at this tech company that is taking on a pretty daunting task. It's really important for a big transition that they're making. They're looking to go from making transactional sales to going to transformational sales, making the typical transition that all tech companies talk about today, which is to move from products to services, and which is a very major cultural shift that needs to take place in the organization. It's an entire business operation reboot. And so setting that stage, why don't you talk about what we encountered as we supported this mission for this leader?
I remember this guy was big into all the different processes. And so we sat with him and we said, let's plan this out. And he's like, yeah, I got it. And when it came time, and I'm going to maybe ruin the ending here, but when it came time to debrief the mission, whether it was successful or not, and they had just happened to have missed their final goal. But again, they made great strides. The team had done a great job to this point. However, because they didn't hit that final number, that final goal that they set for themselves, rather than say, all right, awesome, we got 85% of the way there, they said, oh, you know what, let's move the goalposts in. Let's make it, instead of making it a 100-yard touchdown, because those things are tough, let's make this touchdown an 85-yard touchdown, and we'll call it good.
Yeah.
And I remember we looked at each other like, what in the world are they doing? They were so caught up with being seen as perhaps a failure that they were willing to change the game and reshuffle the deck before they were done.
It's literally the equivalent of that Sports Illustrated athlete on the side of the pool crying, because here you have somebody who'd gone to Stanford Business School and just a brilliant individual leading some incredible things and the hotbed for technology and innovation in the world, and we are watching him and what might be one of his first failures ever to take place. And much like you had to watch some of these athletes fail for the first time, this is the critical moment of assessment. And what do we watch take place? He can't accept that failure. He exposes that he's not a growth mindset type person. He doesn't want to lead a growth mindset type team. He's fixed state, and he believes from this point forward, if I fail, that will define me from this point. It's not just a moment in time. That will be what I am. So what did we see take place with that team over time?
Yeah, it was something that, just like we said, when you can figure out which 5 guys are going to make it through Hell Week, which 5 guys are not, you saw the team just say, all right, this doesn't matter anymore. This isn't important. If we're just going to keep changing the goalposts just to say we were successful artificially, what's the point of going through this whole drill in the first place? And you start to see a lack of interest. People stopped showing up to meetings. People stopped really caring about what they were supposed to be doing on a day in, day out basis.
Yeah, and I think the most interesting thing for me that I saw was that they learned that it was not okay for them to fail either. And so, very clearly the leader had said that there's no such thing as failure. We're going to have a pizza party. You all won. High five. And then the rest of the team realized that we can never make mistakes. So if we do make mistakes, by the way, mistakes are inevitable. We're going to sweep those under the rug. We're going to make it look like a success, and that's just the type of team we're going to be. He defined that team forevermore, and I've watched them struggle. Let's close out with the big takeaways. How do you create these elite teams? This has been a great conversation about the adversity that we experience in very specific environments, but let's now give the 3 big takeaways that we advocate that you do for your teams so that you can create that group that fails forward and iterates and improves and create that culture as well. So number 1, create a debrief environment. Gomez, why don't you talk a little bit about what it takes to create a debrief environment?
So the most important thing that we ever had in the teams as it related to a debrief was to ensure that you were getting the truthful, honest feedback. We had a saying, even at Afterburner, that we prefer respectful truth over artificial harmony. And so in order to get that respectful truth, you as a leader had to stand up and admit your mistakes. You had to humble yourself before the team, because it wasn't about who's right. It's about what's right. And in order to do that, you needed to create a very nameless and rankless environment. And I think it's interesting how the fighter pilots went through that. We had a very open mindset in the SEAL teams when it came to sharing feedback, because we expected to get that from one another. But the fighter pilots, you guys took it in a whole nother way.
Yeah, it was definitely the most important thing that we did. And we just knew every time you made a mistake. I was literally talking to a fighter pilot this weekend, flies F-15s, and he told me about a bad flight that he recently had. And he said, as I'm taxiing in with my aircraft, he said, I'm preparing what I'm going to say to the entire squadron, not to talk about how it's not my fault and give excuses, but he did what every one of us had to do after we make a mistake. And first of all, own it, and then talk about how the team should do something differently to avoid repeating that mistake in the future. Because we know that flying is hard and that we're going to make mistakes. And we actually allow our team members to make mistakes, which is a really important difference from what we saw in that Silicon Valley team. We allow our team members to make mistakes, but we don't allow them to repeat the mistakes. The only way you can stomp those out is if you have a culture that looks backwards and identifies what the debrief points are, what the things are that we can improve on. So number 2, create actionable lessons learned. And when you create those actionable lessons learned that are specific, that are going to change your behavior, you put them into your next plan. Gomez, why don't you talk a little bit about how we incorporate lessons learned into our next plan?
Yeah, it's great. So we have that debrief. Out from that debrief comes all these great lessons learned, these things, these, again, like you said, very actionable steps that we can roll right into the next plan, right into the next day's event or the next month's plan or whatever it is. We can certainly learn from those individual, lessons of the past. And then when you create these actionable lessons learned, it's almost it's a step for the very next plan. It's another course of action that you can immediately start iterating on.
So we've got the debrief conducted. We have an environment where we look backwards. We figure out what worked, what didn't, and then we turn that into an actionable lesson learned so we can change behavior in the future. And we don't just give that lip service. We actually put that into a specific plan that we're going to execute down the road. Talk to me about how we indoctrinate this into our culture now. How do we have this as a leader-led mentality where failure is not fatal? And failure is okay as long as it doesn't make its way to the customer or jeopardize mission success. And how do we create that environment where people believe that it's okay to fail?
Yeah, so that's great. So the way that we incorporate that action is that it has to be a very leader-led process, meaning the leader must demonstrate how they are going to iterate and how they're going to get better. The leader has to stand up in front of the group and admit what they messed up. And it's exactly counter to what we learned in Silicon Valley by that one individual when he stood up and he basically said, hey, listen, it's not okay to fail. I'm going to change the goalposts in order to say that we succeeded. And when you demonstrate that type of culture, that type of environment, you're inevitably telling your team, you cannot fail. You cannot make a mistake, which is extremely counter to what we learned in our environments, in that the leaders admit their mistakes, admit what they failed on, and they're able to ask the teammates then, hey, what did you see that I messed up on? They're humble enough to admit those mistakes because that's where the learning takes place.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we saw the most effective leaders do. And it's the ability to talk about what mistakes were made by the leader in the previous iteration. And oh, by the way, you're not apologizing and you're not asking for forgiveness. This is not emotional. You're just saying, hey, there's no such thing as a perfect mission. Let's get that out in the open right now. And I'm not immune to that either. As a leader, here's what I would do differently if I had this opportunity again. Even on the successful mission, there's always something we can talk about. And then open it up to the crowd and get their feedback so that the team members that are listening see that, hey, it's okay to actually have this conversation. And if the leader's able to get that feedback, surely I am as well. So that when I got to talk to that team member later and tell that team member what he or she's doing wrong, they're not getting defensive and they're not wondering if their job's on the line. They're taking notes because they want to improve and they know that that's the culture we've established. Well, Chris Gomez, thank you very much for this session. It was fantastic getting to talk to you about your Navy SEAL experience, both as a student and as an instructor, about creating elite teams that are able to overcome adversity by creating a debrief environment, identifying actionable lessons learned to put into tomorrow's plan, and then creating that culture, starting with the leader, starting at the top, that shows the rest of the team that failure is not fatal, it's actually inevitable, but you're never allowed to fail the same way twice. Gomez, thanks again for your time on the Business Thorcast. Great having you out here. I'm sure we'll have you on another one. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to the Business Thorcast. For more information on today's episode, please visit our website at www.thebusinessthorcast.com. And if you like this podcast, please rate it and leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Thor, over and out.